Welcome, everyone. My name is Denise Patel. I'm the U.S. Program Director at Gaia. I'm speaking to you from New York City, but I understand we have participants from all over the world, and we're excited to have everyone joining us this morning. Well, morning for me, afternoon for others, evening for others. So thank you so much. So Gaia is holding a global webinar series to share our collective expertise on the issues that we work on, ranging from consumption, plastic pollution, zero waste, impacts of waste incineration, and environmental justice struggles. We hope you enjoy the webinar today and learn from our wonderful speakers that we're going to be having today and throughout the year. For those who are not familiar with Gaia, Gaia is the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. We are a worldwide alliance of more than 800 grassroots groups, non-governmental organizations, and individuals in over 90 countries whose ultimate vision is a just, toxic-free world without incineration. As I mentioned at the start, our webinar today is Anti-Incineration 101. The goal for today is to share basic arguments of why incineration is an obstacle for zero waste and an environmental health threat and a failure in practice. It is designed for communities facing incinerator proposals who want to learn more about the problems of this treatment, differences between technologies, emissions and environmental and health threats, and what happens in the real operations of incinerators. Our speakers that are joining us today, we have with us Jane Bremer. She's based in Western Australia and has worked for environmental health and justice for more than 20 years.
Do you want to come near me too?
Currently the Secretary and Zero Waste and Anti-Incinerator Campaign Coordinator for the National Toxics Network. Jane works collaboratively with Gaia in the Asia Pacific region and internationally with more than 600 member organizations working for a zero waste and incinerator-free future. Jane will talk about why we oppose waste incineration and lay out some of the myths, facts, and impacts of waste incineration on communities. Then after Jane, we have Shlomo Dowen, who has been the national coordinator of UK WIN, the United Kingdom Without Incineration Network, since 2007. Since that time, UK WIN and its members have prevented around 70 incinerators. It's pretty amazing. Shlomo, along with his son Josh, who is also joining us for Q&A, maintain UK WIN's website, and they're currently supporting more than 50 active local campaigns. Shlomo will be presenting on incineration and how it contributes to climate change. And then our third speaker today is Thibault Turchet, who is a lawyer, has a lawyer's background, especially in public and environmental law. He joined Zero Waste France in 2014 as a legal campaigner. He works on environmental law modification led by the Ministry of Ecology to make sure that legal reforms promote waste prevention. And recently he's been working with Ivory's incinerator in the Paris area, as well as other controversial projects. Thibault will outline the economic implications of waste incineration, including the costs, business models, and what is required to make waste incineration financially feasible. Just to walk you through a little bit more about the structure and some of the technical capabilities we have today with our webinar setup. The webinar is going to last about 1.5 hours. First, we're going to hear all of the presentations, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. There's a chat box on your screen, so if you're online, you can see a little icon that says chat next to it, and you can use that to introduce yourselves, share information, or just say hello to us. It's also the place to use it if you have any technical problems. Just let us know via the chat, and Gaia's, my coworker Gaia, Gemma Estrella, will help you figure that out. And then for Q&A, we're going to be actually using there's another box that says Q&A, and you can use that to enter your questions for the speakers. We ask that you not use Q&A for the chat box. And then we have also, just to let you know, muted the audio for the participants to help us avoid any background noise. So please do ask us all the questions through the Q&A. Yep. And then, yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. I want to thank all the speakers for being with us today. And we can kick it off with Jane.
Thank you, and hello and welcome. Now I just have to share my screen, is that right?
Right.
Okay, can everyone see? All right, there? Okay, I'm going to give you a very basic overview of the main arguments against waste to energy incineration, which are basically outlined here. Incinerators actually turn our waste into air pollution and toxic ash. They create about a tonne of ash for every 4 tonnes of waste that are burnt. They destroy the embedded energy that's contained in our waste. And really, when we talk about waste to energy incinerators and energy, we're really talking about often proponents and governments are talking about the calorific value of waste. They compared to zero waste policy, they compare very badly in terms of jobs compared to the recycling sector and all the other zero waste management options that exist. They're stealing renewable energy subsidies and credits from other real renewable projects like solar, wind and wave. They create a fair degree of air pollution, some of which is highly toxic, but they're one of the most expensive forms of energy production. They emit more greenhouse gases, toxic air pollutants and mercury per unit of energy than coal and gas energy plants. It's very important for campaigners to understand the definitions of incineration, because you may often hear that, well, this isn't an incinerator, this is a waste to energy plant or a gasification plant or a pyrolysis plant. So to be really clear, all of these technologies, mass combustion, gasification, pyrolysis and plasma arc, are all defined under EU and US legislation as incineration technologies. And you'll see those references there. I'm going to click through this quite quickly. This is just to give you a brief visual image of the types of incineration technologies that exist. I'm just going to put my primer on so that I don't go over. A mass combustion incinerator, which you'll hear moving grate systems where waste is fed in to a moving grate technology, and it's basically just burnt. The air pollution control captures the pollutants and the ash comes out the bottom there. Pyrolysis is slightly different. Pyrolysis is the heating of this waste without oxygen, and it has been known to generate significant amounts of dioxins and furans. And gasification is similar to pyrolysis but with low oxygen. That's not a very good diagram there. I'm sorry, but it gives you a rough idea of the kind of process that these technologies use. Plasma arc is different. That is a much higher temperature and is still classified as incineration, although it works at a much higher temperature range. So why are those technologies really not suitable for general waste management? And that's because waste is not a homogeneous fuel. As you'll see here, the former president of the International Solid Waste Association, industry themselves recognise that gasification and pyrolysis processes are not suitable for municipal solid waste because our municipal solid waste is so mixed. So it makes it very difficult to control processes when you can't predict and estimate the kinds of materials that are going into the system. I'm just going to flick through here and give you some examples of some spectacular failures around the world of gasification plants in Germany, Italy, and even here in Australia. And all of these facilities were spectacular failures and are no longer operating, had problems all the way through and were eventually shut down and are no longer operating. The solid waste energy facility in Australia was observed to emit a whole range of dangerous pollutants that were recorded. nitrogen oxide emissions particularly, and the sulfuric acid and sulfur trioxide, arsenic, all exceeded the permitted limits. So I mentioned earlier the difference between definitions of energy. Embedded energy, it's important to understand the difference between embedded energy and calorific energy. The terms are often interchanged and used when proponents and governments talk about waste to energy incinerators. The embedded energy is the energy that is refers to the energy that was used for the entire life cycle of the waste products that are going into these facilities. That includes the extraction of the raw materials, the processes to make those material production processes, the packaging, the transporting and the disposal of the product, whereas the calorific energy is really just the energy that's contained in the fuel and is expressed usually in joules per kilogram. And why is that important to know? Because resources and energy are not just technical issues, they're essentially social issues as well. So the solutions that we need to manage our waste resources need a much more cross-sector and broader consideration. And you will have heard about possibly the term a circular economy. That's something that Zero Waste is a critical part of, and we need to move towards a more circular economy. It looks something like that, where we're instead of this linear process of resource extraction, production, consumption and waste disposal, we're using these resources and returning them back into our materials production processes and cutting out the raw materials extraction part, which is so damaging to the planet. There are some very good economists that we work with, and Dr. Jeffrey Morrison is one of the best. Dr. Jeffrey Morris, sorry. He's written a lot about the benefits of recycling compared to incineration and the analysis of the energy that's used there, and has demonstrated that 3 to 4 more times energy is saved through a combination of reuse, recycling and composting, which is really a zero waste approach to managing our waste compared to incineration. And you can see here that, for example, PET, one of the most common plastics, you can save more than 26 times more energy recycling a PET bottle than you can burning that for energy. That's one of his reports. And so if you want to know about the analysis of zero waste against incineration, Dr. Jeffrey Morris is a great resource. Waste incinerators also produce more carbon dioxide than coal burning plants, and Shlomo, I'm sure, is going to go into a lot more detail about the climate impacts. But here you can see another great organisation in the US, Energy and Justice Network, have done a lot of work in this area, and compared to other sources of energy production, you can see that waste incineration is significantly higher than other sources. It's also one of the most expensive forms of energy production. And now I'm just going to, having gone through that very quickly, mention the air emissions, which are a big part of the arguments against waste incineration. And you can see here there's a whole range of emissions that come out of incinerators, some more toxic than others. Why does that matter? Well, it's specifically important. It's very important when it comes to protecting children's health, because children are not just mini adults. They process chemicals and pollution differently. They are disproportionately impacted by pollution. So when we set our policy to protect children's health, we're actually protecting ecosystem health on the whole planet, because we set the best standards for human health protection. And there are many studies documenting this, that there's a disproportionate burden on children's health, particularly in utero and in the very early years, particularly from air pollution. One of the other significant emissions from incinerators that are not readily talked about when they're promoted is the issue of nanoparticles. There are nanoparticles that are engineered into our materials that exist in our waste, and then there are those nanomaterials that are generated through the combustion process and released into our atmosphere. And it's a very serious issue, nano pollution, because they really, actually, there's a little bit more clearer picture here, but they're so small that they really bypass the blood-brain barrier and can transfer directly into the organs and blood, and with it they take a whole range of toxins with them. So they're a very serious pollutant that currently isn't really regulated by the incineration industry. And that nanoparticles also pose a significant global risk to human health because they travel such long distances and they stay intact. Some of the pollutants that incinerators emit are classified persistent organic pollutants. And why is that important? Well, we have an international convention called the Stockholm Convention, whose objective is to protect human health and the environment globally from persistent organic pollutants. And we know that incinerators are the second largest generator of persistent organic pollutants. And they have wide-ranging impacts on our health. They act like fat-soluble hormones. They disrupt all sorts of endocrine systems and thyroid, all sorts of processes in our body. They're linked to cancer, diabetes, developmental problems, and Dr. Linda Birnbauer is an excellent source of information on the impacts of dioxins on human health. We know that when corporations and governments often promote incinerator technologies, they often refer to Japan. And I just wanted to make a small comment about Japan and their high use of incinerators and what that has meant for their country and the contribution that those incinerators make globally. And the United Nations Environment Programme has documented that the greatest source of dioxin emissions is coming from Japan, and that also is a country that has some of the highest levels of dioxins in the bodies of their citizens. This is just a quick excerpt from that report that shows the table there with, and you can see there that the high level here is Japan, the USA is next, and that's from the United Nations UNEP program's dioxin and furan inventories. So apart from the air pollution, the other major issue with incineration is the amount of ash that's generated. IPEN and Arnica have written reports on this. They're a great authority on the toxicity aspects of incinerator ash. Incinerator ash is not something that is talked about much when incinerator proponents and governments promote this industry, and it really flies in the face of the claims that the proponents make about reducing waste to landfill. In effect, what we're doing is we're reducing the volume of waste, but into a more hazardous and toxic nature in a form of ash that no one really wants to deal with. And you can see there some of the contaminant profile of fly ash and bonnet ash from one of the incinerators in Netherlands. Air pollution, we're facing catastrophic climate change, as you will have all heard. Recently, a UN report just in the last few days highlighting the dire impacts of climate change and pollution, and the impact that climate change causes in exacerbating pollution incidences. And there's some reasons there for you to have a look at. And there's a lot of medical and scientific studies available now to confirm the dire global consequences of exposure to environmental pollution. So what protects us from incinerator pollution really boils down often to the industrial regulatory framework that exists in those countries that they're operating. And to protect public health, we need strong regulations, we need monitoring to demonstrate compliance with those regulations, and then we need tough enforcement of those regulations. And if any of those links are not upheld, then the public health, it really isn't protected. So When it comes to incinerator regulations, you'll often hear, as we do in Australia, that the industry is perfectly safe because it will operate to the strict EU standards, which basically refer to the Waste Incinerator Directive and BREF, which is currently under review now. So it was a document that was written in 2006, is currently being reviewed right now. It's not finalised, but in Australia we've been looking at the BREF, and our analysis is that it's insufficient in a number of areas. The BREF doesn't include a full life cycle impact of the projects, and with incinerator projects are generally 25 to 30 years duration minimum. The EU BREF hasn't adequately addressed climate impacts and hasn't addressed the inability to predict emissions and therefore regulate them due to the fact that waste is a heterogeneous product input. It hasn't addressed all the other areas or the other operating conditions where emissions are known to be excessive and meeting or going well above the standards that are applied during the other than normal operating conditions, bypass events, cold startups and shutdowns, and it hasn't addressed nanoparticles. In 1998, Dufresne and Weavers published a groundbreaking study showing that the current method of the US EPA, the monitoring method for dioxin, for example, was underestimating dioxin emissions by 30 to 50-fold. And they suggested that a more reliable and effective way of monitoring the emissions from incinerators would be to measure them in the soil and consider the deposition rates. That gave a better, truer picture of the amounts of dioxin that are being released from incinerators, and then they proposed the MESA sampling system to do that. More recently, increasing evidence is coming out about the amounts of dioxins that are being found in the surrounding environment around incinerators. And you can read the great report by Toxico Watch through Zero Waste Europe, Hidden Emissions, a case study of Netherlands incinerators. And that's been presented around the world by Abel Archenbout. Also, Zero Waste Europe has some other great reports on the oh, and there's my time up. Sorry, stop. Zero Waste Europe also has some great reports on the air emissions from incinerators. One other quick thing I'm going to sneak in before I finish is that apart from the ash, apart from the incinerator pollution and the loss of finite resources and the linear process, the destructive linear process that incinerators represent, there's also the issue of incinerator accidents and fires that never get talked about. And Arnica is an EU organisation that's been documenting this and has a great database of incinerator accidents and fires all over Europe. I'm just going to leave them in there for you to have a look at, but it is an industry that does catch fire, and when they do, that's a significant release of pollution and impacts to the surrounding community. So what is the EU doing about their significant role in incinerating waste? As the rest of the world looks to them, particularly in the global south, they're moving in a different direction, and they're taking on a zero waste and circular economy agenda. And recently have passed legislation to require all member states to separate their organic waste. That's a really important part of a zero waste process. And they've asked their member states to phase out incineration and all the subsidies and things that support incineration. Incinerators decommission old facilities and not set up new ones, and instead focus on sustainable zero waste management instead. So that's worth knowing, because there are a number of a number of incredible zero waste case studies happening in Europe at the moment. There are some examples. This is where Europe is heading. So it really is one of those myths that Europe loves their incinerators. They're being promoted all over the world. That's a myth. Europe is heading in a different direction. Here are some of the case studies that demonstrate that. If you haven't heard of Paul Connett, you really need to get hold of his book. One of the best experts on waste incineration in the world. San Francisco, for example, is also pursuing zero waste models and moving away from incineration. San Francisco is a great example of the effective impressive results they're getting from a zero waste system. We know that there are many innovative alternatives to the problematic waste streams that are going into incinerators, which are predominantly single-use, non-recyclable plastic packaging. That's one of them. And we know that there are other alternatives to incinerators for residual waste, which is predominantly the waste stream that's going to incinerators. In Australia, we've written a report and some fact sheets which are welcome to access on our website. And thank you very much. I know I've gone over time and gone very fast, but hopefully you'll be able to get a copy of this presentation, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Jane. So yes, as Jane mentioned, we will be sharing the presentations, and she did a great job of adding those links into the presentation. So you'll have all of those along with the recording. And I do want to remind folks, if you have questions for Jane, we'll have opportunities to ask those, and she'll have a chance to answer them after the presentations are finished. And you can enter your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So up next, we have Shlomo Dowen from UK Win. As soon as you're ready, Shlomo, we can start your presentation.
Excellent. Can everyone see the presentation? Can you? All right. Okay. Just a moment. Let's share that. Okay, Denise, can you confirm that you can see that?
We can see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Jane and Denise and everyone else. And hello, everyone who's there. I'm here with Joshua, who is the author of the report. I'll be doing the presentation, and Josh will be on hand to respond to questions arising. Here you can see a photo from our annual general meeting, and the title, Climate Change Impacts of Waste Incineration in the UK. It's a narrower focus, so I don't have the challenge that Jane had to cover all the bases. Let me hopefully, yes, good. So the report that I referred to earlier was released in October last year, the end of October. The report explores a variety of different adverse climate impacts arising from incineration, including direct CO2 emissions from the incineration of mixed waste, the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy or electricity generated, what is known as carbon intensity of the energy, the relative CO2 emissions of incineration when compared with landfill, the recyclability, in fact, the very high level of recyclability of the material that is used in the UK as incineration feedstock. And then we try to monetize the unpaid climate change cost to society of waste incineration. So that was a very ambitious goal for our report, and the report will be something that will be circulated to everyone here. And also, of course, it's available online from ukwin.org.uk/climate. So the question begins, why is burning waste releasing so much CO2? Well, CO2 is made up of a molecule of CO2 is made up of a carbon atom, the C, and 2 oxygen atoms, the O2. So because about 27% of the residual waste used in the UK for incinerator feedstock is made up of carbon, and I appreciate that this differs country to country depending on, so for example, in the global south, there has historically been less plastic and more food waste. When burned, the carbon that is in the waste combines with the oxygen in the air to produce CO2. Now, because the oxygen in the air is heavier than the carbon, it means that the burning of 1 ton of carbon results in the creation of 3.66 tons of CO2. So a trick of the trade is to refer to CO2 rather than carbon. Plastic is more than half carbon, and of course it's fossil carbon. So burning a ton of plastic releases nearly 2 tons of CO2 because of the combination with oxygen. Okay, we're moving on. Because conventional plastic is derived from petroleum, oil, it is a fossil fuel. So the CO2 from the burning of plastic is known as fossil CO2 or fossil carbon. The CO2 from organic matter is described as biogenic or short cycle CO2. Now, for some purposes, the biogenic emissions are not included in calculating the emissions from incinerators. Obviously, there is a strong argument why it should be. The environment doesn't differentiate between fossil and biogenic CO2. That's a human construct. But in order for our report to stand up to the inevitable criticism from the waste industry, the report does focus on fossil CO2. In the UK, roughly 1 ton of CO2 is released per ton of waste burned. Obviously, that depends on the exact composition of that ton of waste, but on average. And roughly half of this ton of CO2 is fossil CO2 and the other half biogenic. When we're talking about carbon intensity, and again, because the report is looking to be as unassailable as possible, we, for comparative purposes, for comparing wind power and solar power, we've included the, if you like, climate cost of actually building and installing the wind turbines or the solar panels, because otherwise, of course, there would just be zeros there, because wind and solar don't release any CO2 when they're operating. CCGT is shorthand for combined cycle gas turbine. This is the modern industry standard way of generating energy in most developed Western countries. Energy from burning gas that then turns a turbine fairly efficiently compared to incinerators. The energy produced from such gas turbines comes with a cost of roughly 340 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. It's sort of down from 360. They're always trying to make greater efficiencies with turbine technology, etc. In 2017, the average of UK incinerators were producing electricity with a carbon intensity of nearly 800 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. In other words, roughly 23 times greater than genuinely low carbon sources. So of course it is frustrating for us to hear energy generated from incineration being described as low carbon energy. That is the situation in absolute terms per unit of electricity generated. It compares the different forms of energy generation, but now we move to a slide that describes and compares the roughly 800 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour associated with incineration, compared to the aspirations and achievements within the UK as we move towards a decarbonized electricity supply. So the UK aspires to being zero carbon by 2050. I know it's a long time in the future, and there are possibilities that an incoming Labour government could try to bring that forward. But currently, in order to meet the 2050 commitment for decarbonized energy, the government has produced figures, the UK government has produced figures showing how energy generation needs to reduce its carbon intensity year on year. So what that means is that in 2010, incineration was roughly twice as bad as the generation-based grid average, which is a mix that included some coal, some gas, some solar, very small amounts of geothermal, and plenty of wind power. As the proportion of renewable energy and low carbon energy increases, then the difference between incineration and the average mix increases. So you can see there, it is by 2029, incineration is roughly 8 times the generation-based grid average of about 100. And the UK government's, Her Majesty's Treasury Green Book on Appraisal and Evaluation of Energy Use and Greenhouse Gas Emissions makes it clear that this is the correct metric to use when comparing new facilities that are just coming online. I can answer any questions about that, but for now I'll move on to one even more intense slide, and I'll talk you around the slide. For the purpose of our climate change report, we calculated what the capacity of an average UK incinerator. So in the UK, there are some very small incinerators, and there are some incinerators that have a capacity to process more than, or getting on for 1 million tons of waste a year. When we averaged out those that were actually operating in 2017, and we looked at the actual quantities of waste that was burned, we came up with a figure of 265,000 tons per annum. When sending 265,000 tons of waste to incineration, compared to untreated to landfill. Obviously, there are ways to biostabilize the waste prior to landfill, and indeed there are many more beneficial final destinations, particularly for material that could be composted. But once again, to remain in our unassailable position, we modeled incineration relative to landfill. The model used a number of official government sources, including DEFRA's carbon-based modeling approach and the grid, the marginal electricity mix that we referred to earlier, as well as anticipated changes in feedstock and the ability of landfill to actually act as a carbon sink to store carbon that would be released into the atmosphere straight away if it was burned. what we did for our model was excluded biogenic CO2 on both sides of the model, except in relation to biogenic carbon sequestered in landfill, which is stored carbon that would be released if it was incinerated. If we take, so we've got 3 cases to account for changes in feedstock over the coming 20 years. Our base case is really more or less what is currently the case in the UK. The direct emissions relate to methane. So when people tell you, oh, well, incineration is far better because when you send waste to landfill, then there's all this methane, which is 23 or 25 times worse than CO2. Actually, the plastic that is burnt does not release methane if it's sent to landfill, and the biogenic material, the methane that is released, some of it can be captured and used as a fuel. But even if we just take the direct emissions of methane and fossil, we see that incineration is far more carbon intense, releases far more than landfill. Even if we offset for the energy generated from incineration, which is far more than the energy generated for landfill, when we also take account of the biogenic carbon stored in the earth through landfill, we can see that actually relative to incineration, landfill releases far less by way of greenhouse gas emissions. The picture changes slightly in a reduced plastic scenario. So if in the future there is a reduction of plastics going through the waste stream, we can see that it's still the case that landfill is better. And as you would expect, those benefits of landfill over incineration are even greater for reducing food, garden, and soil, which means that there's a higher proportion of plastic. Again, we can answer any questions, and I can bring this slide back if anyone finds it helpful. The impacts of avoiding incineration. So the report estimated that around half of UK's residual waste feedstock is readily recyclable. We didn't quantify the CO2 benefits of recycling compared to incineration. Obviously, that work is there to be done. We didn't quantify the CO2 impacts of biostabilizing the waste prior to landfill, or indeed comparing it with anaerobic digestion, but we did calculate the unpaid CO2 cost that supports the case for an incineration tax in the UK. Right, okay, that is the presentation. We didn't have the punchline there about the quantity of unpaid costs of CO2 to society, but we'll get that for you as part of the Q&A. So I'm going to hand back over to Denise now, if that's all right.
Great, thank you so much for that, Shlomo. We'll definitely have some time for Q&A, and we can bring that back up. And thank you for that great presentation. It was definitely informative for me. So next up, we have Thibault Turchet from Zero Waste France, who's going to talk about some of the financial implications of incineration. So as soon as you're ready, we can go ahead and screen share, and you can go ahead and get started.
Yep, sure. Thanks. Hello. Can you see it? It's good?
Yeah. Yep, it's up,
Okay.
and it's full screen. Great.
Okay, so let's go 15 minutes. So hello everybody, I'm Thibault from Zero Waste France. We're based in Paris. It's the 10 of us basically, trying to promote zero waste and fight incineration in France as well. So I'm going to try to develop economic aspects of incineration, how we understand it on the French perspective, but I guess you are in similar situations. So the big facts of incineration in France is that we have 124 plants actually running right now. So it's pretty hard in this context to fight incineration, because actually it's something quite common, in the waste treatment landscape here. But still, we put pressure. It's 15 million tons of waste incinerated every year. Most of it is actually municipal waste and residuals, actually. So the waste that is not separated at source. A little bit more than 30% of our municipal waste is burnt. 1/3 is going to landfill, and basically 1/3 is recycled or composted. So incineration has quite a big part of waste, and especially municipal waste treatment in France. It produces around 3 million tons of bottom ashes, so that makes the link with what Jane was saying earlier. So it's the non-hazardous part of the waste, I mean, legally talking. And it's more than 400,000 tons of hazardous waste that is produced by incinerators in France. The whole part of it is going to Germany or in hazardous landfills in France. On the residual waste, we produce, each French produces 261 kilograms of residual waste, so it's the not separated part of the waste, and it's going, of course, to be incinerated or landfilled. And as you mentioned, Shlomo, half of it is actually recyclable or compostable, and big part could be reduced at source. So that's what we want to work about and show, to say, okay, we can reduce incineration. Most of the plants are run by private operators. I guess Veolia, Suez are the big players in what we call private public partnership. So basically it's public paying private operators to run the plants. So first, why incineration is a problem on the economic perspective? Because of course it costs a lot. It's very expensive. Small plants usually cost at least 70 to 80 million euros, which is quite a big amount of money. And the biggest plants is, for example, the Paris in Paris area, we'll talk about it later, cost a lot. Just investment, so building, I'm not talking about operating the plant, just building for the biggest one is cost around 500 million euros. So I guess it's one of the most expensive things you can find in environmental fights. Talking about investment per ton, the figures are pretty different depending on the plants, when they were built, where they are in urban places or not. But a recent plant, for example, pretty small one close to Troyes, that's the name of the city, it cost 1,300 euros per ton of investment. This plant includes maturation of bottom ashes, so it's quite original. For example, Issy-les-Moulineaux, which is one of the big Paris area incinerator, it's a very big plant, very modern, did cost more than 1,000 euro per ton. We wrote an article about this plant because many people from abroad actually visit it, because it's kind of showcase of incineration in France. So please, if some officials from your countries visit this plant and say, okay, we went to Issy-les-Moulineaux, it's great, please, you will find an article in English, we translated it, so you can answer and say, okay, it's not that great, we'll talk about it later. Maybe I will send the link after the webinar. Operating costs. So after you invested, of course, it's very expensive. You have to operate the plants. do you see my mouse? Do you see the screen? So basically what you have to look at are those two figures. It's a cost per ton in euros. So dollar, euros, quite same thing. The cost is basically more than 100 euros per ton. This is the total cost, and this is the cost when you remove electricity or heating benefits. So it decreases a little bit the invoice for taxpayers. We'll talk about it later. So what you have to look at is those two figures. This is it's not average, this is median. So it means that, you know, half of the plants are under and half of the plants are above. So it's more expensive. So you have very different prices, but basically you have to, in France, the price of incineration just for, you know, per ton treatment is around 100 and 110 euros. So it's quite expensive actually as well compared to landfill, for example. Landfill, it's here, stockage, which is way cheaper in France. That's why we landfill a lot of waste as well. So those are the figures produced by our kind of national EPA, environmental agency. So it's quite expensive. You have to run the plants, and, you know, incineration wants waste. It's pretty hard to decrease when you build the plants. I chose two examples actually to, you know, kind of illustrate what I'm saying. Let's go back to the Troy plant, which is kind of pretty small for France, so 60,000 tons a year, which is actually being built right now. We try to oppose, but we're kind of losing this fight. So each year, the plan is that it's going to cost 5.3 million euros. So you have 80 million euros of investment and 5.3 every year. Actually, the most expensive is pay, of course, people who work in the plants, pretty normal, pollution management and technical maintenance. So yeah, 5 million euros every year is quite a lot. And it's around 108 euros per ton. So, you know, it's quite coherent with what I showed just before. SICTOM is okay, a city cluster, so it's Paris plus 80 municipalities. So it's a public entity which is running 3 massive plants, more than 500,000 tons each, for 1.8 million tons a year burnt. The total cost of incineration just for running the plants for this city cluster, so Paris plus 80 municipalities, is 216 million euros a year. So it doesn't include investment cost. So of course it's huge, and that's why in the Parisian area we recycle less than 20% waste, which is kind of horrible and way under the French average. So it's worst, one of the worst area in France in terms of composting, recycling, etc. The real cost is 132 million euros. Because as we will see later, actually the SICTOM is selling a lot of electricity and heat to you know, the neighbors, so it makes a lot of money. So actually incineration is at the same time in the Paris area pretty expensive. It's a lot of money, as you can see, it's hundreds of millions of euros. But per ton, because the plants are so massive and so kind of, you know, efficient, because they decrease the scale cost, etc., it's only 71 euros per ton. So it's kind of, you know, paradoxal, but that's the problem of incineration. It's very expensive when you look at the figures, and compared to, you know, the rest of activities, you're like, okay, it's actually not that expensive. That's why they keep, you know, investing so much money in those plants. I believe that it's very expensive. You know, I'm not trying to justify incineration. So what you have to have in mind is that incineration business model, at least in France, is more and more linked to what I called other revenues, and especially electricity produced by those plants and heat. So I heard that Shlomo showed that it's not that renewable and carbon low, etc. But actually, they produce this energy and they sell it. You can see the prices for electricity and for incineration. That's average, so it can be more or less. And of course, it's a lot of money for them. I will give you figures right after. They can also have few revenues from bottom ashes because you can find ferrous and non-ferrous metals in the bottom ashes, and of course they manage to increase what they can recover in those ferrous and non-ferrous to get a little bit of money. It's good for them. And usually in most of incineration plants in France, around 5 to 15% of the capacity is dedicated to treat commercial and industrial waste. So not coming from municipalities, coming from private actors, industries, etc. So that I think usually they invoice a little bit higher this industrial waste compared to municipal waste. So it makes the business model work better for the corporations that run the plants. So, for example, for still this 60,000 ton plant close to Troyes, which is operated by Veolia, heat distribution, make them earn around 1 million euros, and for electricity is 2 million euros. So actually, that's huge for them. If they do not recover energy, then the business model is kind of dead. Is going to be way more expensive, and they treat a little bit of commercial waste as well. The thing is that in this city there is almost no pay-as-you-throw, no prevention action, no separation of organics. The residual amount per inhabitant is pretty high compared to the French average. And basically, it's city cluster considers that they're going to build an incinerator, so the problem is solved for the next 20 years, which is of course false. And certainly a smaller incinerator would be a little bit more okay for us, but definitely this one is too big. So for the Paris area, it's even worse. So the other revenues from energy, it's 67 million euros. So it's a lot for them. Less than 20% of waste is recycled. Of course, the waste production in Paris area is huge, way more than in the rest of France. And what you have to see is that it's a trap. Actually, energy recovery, it's a trap because the revenues actually decrease the invoice sent to the taxpayer. So you and me, the inhabitants, people living here. So that's why they say, okay, we recover energy, which is good for climate, etc. But the most, of course, important argument for them is that we decrease the invoice for people, and that's a trap. Once the incinerator is built, once you recover electricity, once you have your heating network, then it's done. Of course, it's impossible to reduce. It's very hard to reduce your incineration capacity. You have to wait for 20 more years, to maybe revamp the plant, etc., etc. So, of course, the best is that the incinerator is not built, because once it's done, then you're linked to the energy recovery. Okay, I have just 1 minute left. There are a lot of the gifts to incineration in France. They have very low tax rates. They have VAT cut on heat. There is a feed-in tariff for electricity, good reputation for, it's 50% renewable. The government is supporting new heating networks in the cities. They have easygoing regulation on bottom ashes management. Of course, if they had to landfill all the bottom ashes, then the business model would be dead as well. So they need, easygoing regulations so they can spread the bottom ashes in construction, under the roads, etc., etc. So that's a lot of gifts you have to pay attention in your countries. National regulations make sure that they do not, they don't. It's not a gift to incineration. Really pay attention to those schemes. Energy scheme, bottom ashes regulations, etc., etc. Maybe we can talk about it later if you want. Last slide, I guess. Yep. Last slide. You can see the symptom. So Paris area debt is going to increase and go beyond 1 billion euros of debt in 2023. So of course that's private banks are financing those plants investments. And you can see here reconstruction IP13 is the new plant we are fighting close to Paris, is going to cost this amount of investment. And you can see the rest of investments that are of course very low. This is also another incineration plant. So actually those two things are incineration investments, and this is prevention. You can see 20 million euros. So of course investments are huge in revamping, especially revamping the plants, and it creates a lot of debt. Private banks of course give the money, and it's a shame. It's terrible for recycling rates in Paris area. So yeah, you have to pay attention to financial locking effects. Investment is huge. Of course, operation cost is huge as well. Usually the contracts for new plants at least last from 15 to 20 years, sometimes 23 years. So of course you are engaged, as a municipality, you have to, respect the contract for 20 years. So there is no way you can touch to waste management during that amount of time. The energy sales makes waste treatment way cheaper, so it's kind of a trap you have to be really careful about. There is an addiction to heating networks as well, especially in big cities. It's a massive argument, given by incineration industry. Say you want to cut heating for hospital, you don't want to do that. So it's pretty hard to, answer those arguments. And of course, administrative locking effect. When the plant is built, then the municipality doesn't want to work more on prevention, because they consider that the problem is solved for the 20 coming years. Few people work on prevention. Of course, you don't have investment capacity in other plants, such as sorting facilities, composting plants, prevention things, because you invested all your money in the brand new incineration plants. So I hope those figures were useful for you. I will share it, maybe just modify a few things. And of course, we are available at Zero France to talk about incineration whenever you want. Hope that was helpful. Thank you for listening and being here.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I just want to very quickly note for all of our attendees that if you have questions for our panelists, you can enter them in the Q&A box, which will be at the bottom of your screen. And we have a few questions already. I also just want to let folks know that we will be sharing the presentations along with the webinar recording after everything is put together, and you will get an email if you signed up for the webinar today in like a day or two. So we'll have all of those things put together and available for you as well. So we've got some great questions. I'm going to start reading them out for the panelists. If you open the Q&A box, you can actually read the questions as well. And I ask that we have about 20 minutes for questions. And so for each of the panelists, I want to make sure we get through as many questions as possible. You try to keep your responses concise to make sure we can get to all of them. So one of the early questions that a few people have asked about is about modern incinerators. and new technology. So what is the latest technology available in incineration, and is it any different than the older technology? I'd love to pose a question to start with Jane, and then Shlomo as well to answer those questions. And I'm sure, Thibault, you might have some indication just based on what you know from the finance end of that too. So, Jane, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Look, yeah, that's one of the myths about the incineration story, is that suddenly we have all these new high-tech incinerators, but really the technologies for incineration haven't changed much at all. What has changed is improved air pollution control units in these incinerators. So as the science and the evidence has grown about the adverse impacts of incinerator and the pollution and the air emissions and the gas impacts, regulators around the world have increased the requirements for their operations. So, and I'm sure Phil can jump in, but the most expensive aspects of incineration technologies are the air pollution control units. And that's because prior to about 1999, I believe, that's when it became very clear that incinerators were the major source of global distribution of dioxins. And so incinerators were required to upgrade their air pollution control units to capture that and prevent those emissions because of the globally significant adverse impacts of dioxin and other persistent organic pollutants. So incineration technologies, no, haven't changed much over the years. It's the air pollution control units that make them more modern. And that's what industry and governments are really talking about when they talk about the latest improved incinerator technologies.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jane. And just to pick up on that, of course, the scrubbers and other things that have been introduced to try to manage the situation don't capture the CO2. So although there are fewer toxic emissions to air, that doesn't cover climate change impact. And also, of course, if there are fewer emissions to air, that means more of the toxins are captured by the filters, and then you have air pollution control residue, which has to be addressed. And as Theobald will explain, of course, the whole process of having more filters pushes up the financial cost of incinerators as well as the actual land use that is taken up by the facility.
Yeah, definitely. It's more and more expensive, especially, for example, Paris area's incinerators are, so big and very, very expensive. If you want to see actually what are emissions, for example, for Issy Les Moulineaux incineration plant, you can see our articles because we screened the annual reports, so you can actually see which amount of pollutants, monitored pollutants, are emitted every year in tons and kilograms. So maybe you can see directly this article, but yeah, new technologies are very, very expensive. That, on my perspective, that's what I want to say.
So somebody had another question about operational cost. It's a question from Yovel from Indonesia. And I think this question is directed to Thibault. Does the operational cost per ton include operational costs for segregated collection system or pre-treatment and pre-sorting before burning? No. And then does the term residuals that is being burned in France include recyclable plastic in it?
Oh yeah, sure. There is all kinds of waste in residuals. A lot of organics, 10% of it is pretty much organics, plastics, metals, anything you can find, in garbages. So that's one major problem. Just dividing residuals maybe by 50% in France, we could, shut down many incineration plants. So that's one of our major arguments. Concerning the cost, I gave you around 100 euros per ton. This does not include collection costs, for example. So actually the whole cost of collecting, transferring and burning waste maybe is around 200, 250 euros per ton. So yeah, that was only the cost treatment, not the collection, which is pretty big as well, because of course in France we have those big trucks using a lot of oil, and I didn't develop this spec, but it's way more if you include the whole cost of collection and treatment then.
And then another technical question related to some of the pollution and health aspects. Where did it go? Perhaps Jane, there was a question for you that I think might have gotten answered. I have lost it. But there is a related question. So also a question from Yobel again. It was, so in Indonesia, they're facing a lot of small scale thermal technologies, especially hydrothermal, liquid fuel, and oil. Do you have information on the source of POPs, the persistent pollutants from the small scale waste to fuel oil? And one of the claims that they make is that the dioxin and furans vaporize during the process. Can you speak to that and acknowledge whether or not that claim is true?
I'm assuming me, so I'm just going to jump in. So dioxins are created whenever you heat or burn materials that contain chlorine. So the problem with the residual waste stream is, it often don't know what's in there. It's hard to tell one bit of plastic from another. So things like PVC entering the waste stream, they're the kinds of things that are going to create dioxin emissions. There are also persistent organic pollutants that are embedded in the waste stream. So, in Australia, and I see a lot of new proposals talking about not just processing municipal solid residual waste, but also commercial and industrial and construction and demolition waste. Now we know those waste streams contain mixed and composite materials. Construction and demolition waste can contain pesticide residues. Once those things go into an incinerator, they can generate dioxins and other persistent organic pollutants. So dioxins don't just vaporize and disappear. They are created through the process of incineration, but they're also created outside of the stack through a process called the de novo synthesis. This is the subject of the reports that Abel Archambaut at Toxico Watch documented when they looked at the case study of the Netherlands plant. It explains why the incineration industry can produce regulatory reports that show that the amounts of dioxin coming out of their stacks are small, but yet in the surrounding environment, the levels of dioxins in the soil that are being measured in eggs and dairy around incinerator plants don't match what the incinerator companies say, basically. So the deposition of dioxin in the environment is a better indication of the dioxin emissions from incinerator plants. And so, these plastic to fuel projects are usually lower temperature processes. So anything, I'm pretty certain, and jump in Shlomo and Thibault, but I think anything less than 850 degrees is at risk of generating dioxins. You need really high temperatures and rapid quenching systems to control dioxins, and most of these incinerators don't have those. In fact, I think it's only hazardous waste incinerators that have quenching systems that adequately control dioxins. I think waste to energy incinerators don't do that. I don't know if that answers the question adequately. Was that? Anyone else want to jump in?
I know that in France they try to implement gasification plant, but it looks like they faced massive failures. In UK, Shlomo, you published a report, in Germany as well. So it's kind of new trend that's going to save us, but the pilots hardly proved that it actually works. And it's been years and years that they say, yeah, it's gonna come, it's gonna come. So far, nothing is really happening. So we try to follow this and try to know what's shit, what's not. But so far, yeah, it's gasification, which is a new trend, is not really popping and working. So we'll give you information if that happens. Sorry, I have no more information.
Okay, there were two questions related to the dioxins and furans, one also from Bulgaria. So thank you for answering that. I think you covered it, Jane. We had a couple of other questions about, we had a question about carbon dioxide and climate change. So Shlomo, if you wanted to address this would be great. Can you provide a little bit more of an explanation on burning plastic mixed waste for how it produces carbon dioxide and contributes to climate change? I think they were just looking for a little bit more info on that.
Yep, okay, great. Well, this gives me an opportunity to talk numbers for a moment about sort of the cost, etc. Burning a ton of plastics comes with a cost, an unpaid cost to society of between 100 and 200 pounds sterling. So the climate, the adverse climate impact of burning plastics, and now we're talking about burning plastics not in the open, but in the controlled conditions that Jane was describing in relation to proper waste incinerators. The plastics can make up about a third of the feedstock, but half of the calorific value of the feedstock. So it's very important for operators to continue to burn plastics. The argument, if you like, the false argument that is used is that burning plastics generates energy, but of course the energy that is generated very inefficiently, in the region of 20% of the calorific value of the plastic converted to energy. And obviously it comes at a very high cost in terms of climate change. So our report estimated that based on the UK government's carbon price, the unpaid fossil CO2 cost of burning a ton of mixed waste, which is mostly not plastic, ranged from well, it actually rises year on year from about 30 pounds a ton now to more than 100 pounds a ton in the future. And as I say, double that if what we're looking at is just burning plastic. So in 2017, roughly 5 million tons of mixed waste was burnt in the UK. That came at an unpaid cost of £325 million. If we then extend that over the next 30 years, the cost rises to about £25 billion. So that there's a quantifiable adverse impact of climate change. I know the question was about more of an explanation. A lot of the explanation is actually in the report, which will be circulated, but anyone who reads the report who wants further discussion or answering specific questions can get in touch with me and Josh, and we'll do our best to field those questions.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, we have time for a couple more questions. So the first question I have is for all of the panelists. If you could be brief, but because I know there's another question I really do want to get to as well. But for developing countries, what are the other options for waste, like options other than waste incineration? This question comes from somebody in Vietnam who says that the government is still considering waste incineration as an option for waste treatment. So what are the alternatives?
Well, in a nutshell, it's zero waste policy that's the alternative to waste incineration. So incineration is when we deal with the end of our materials production processes. If we want to manage our waste, we have to put the focus at the front end. How we have to reduce the amount of waste we generate. We have to collect it in such a way that we preserve those resources, separate the different materials that are in our waste stream so that we can recycle, reuse and compost those things. So particularly in Southeast Asia, organics is is the predominant part of the waste stream. So it makes no sense to burn organic waste at all. It makes much more sense to compost organic waste. It has far greater climate benefits and health benefits to be composting organic waste. So once you take the organic waste out of the waste stream and compost that, put it back into the biosphere, because goodness knows the biosphere needs carbon, not the atmosphere. Then you're left with recyclable wastes. Once you separate those effectively, particularly keeping the paper clean and dry and separate, preventing it from being contaminated, then you can recycle or reuse that paper. The same with recyclable plastic. What makes up the most of the residual waste stream is non-recyclable single-use plastics and packaging, frankly, and poor waste management where materials are being thrown in and contaminated, and then they contaminate the whole waste stream. So, for example, in Australia, we have a mixed recyclable bin, and that's what's really undermining the recycling industry and better waste outcomes, because we throw all of our recyclable materials in there, paper, plastic, everything goes in there. And then a truck comes around and it picks up that one bin, it throws it into the back of the truck, and then it compresses it. Smash goes the glass. You've lost that resource. So source separation and separate collection is key to sustainable waste management. So say you do all of those things, you get the organics out, you separate the paper, you make sure that your recyclable materials are clean, and you're left with what really should be 10% or less of the waste stream that is legitimately classified as residual waste. It makes no sense to build massively expensive and polluting infrastructure to deal with the smallest fraction of our waste stream. So rather than burning that small amount of waste in an incinerator, there are other things we can do. The first thing we need to do is not hide it by sticking it in an incinerator or in landfill. We need to take a really good look at our residual waste and look at how we can reduce it, eliminate it, further recycle it. As Shlomo has mentioned, you can further process residual waste and separate, pull the recyclables and all sorts of other waste streams out. So then what you're left with is something that the question then is it better to landfill that or burn it? Or as Professor Paul Connett would say, let's set up a residual waste research centre and look at that residual waste and work out in society how we can reduce that and ultimately eliminate it. That is a plan, a future plan for sustainable waste management. When we build incinerators, we provide this perverse incentive not to do any of those more sustainable zero waste practices like source separation, composting, those sorts of things, actually face our waste and look at our residual waste. So then we can think about other things like non-combustion technologies to deal with residual waste, and they exist. We don't talk about them much, but they do exist. Mechanical recovery, biological treatment plants, where you can take that waste, you can autoclave it and sterilize it, you can shred it, and then it can become either it can be contained or put in a landfill. It's benign, it's not going to leach toxins or methane back into the environment, you've rendered it into a benign kind of material that can be stored or put in landfill or reused later. There are also other emerging technologies. I mean, they're more around the hazardous waste infrastructure like gas phase chemical reduction. But, you know, when we're talking about non-recyclable single-use plastics, we really do need to start to look at non-combustion technologies, because we have to remember that the incineration industry is very aligned with the fossil fuel industry and plastics production, vertically and horizontally. So the plastics industry wants incineration because it keeps their business model going, keeps the raw materials extraction going, the production going. If we don't dispose of residual plastics, then, you know, we're putting them back into the system and reusing and recycling them, then the other arm of that same industry, the raw materials extraction sector, is losing business. So I think we have to remember that the incineration industry actually is part of the whole extractive fossil fuels industry business model. Sorry, I went a bit off track there, but
actually, that was a really good wrap up. I was about to ask another question, which somebody had, which was really just about, like, what do you say to policymakers and investors who are politically and profit driven, given that the priority is to just get rid of waste in the street, because the trade-offs aren't easy. I mean, I think your outline of zero waste was really helpful in answering that question. I know we have to wrap up, and I know a couple of our panelists have to run, but I do want to thank each of the panelists for joining us. I don't know if you had, Tybalt or Shlomo, had like a quick sentence you wanted to share with folks, but I would love to, you know, give you an opportunity to do that, and then I can let folks who are the attendees know about our upcoming webinar next week.
Stay strong.
That's great.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you for
Bye.
joining.
Sorry,
you.
I have a train. Bye.
Excellent. And just that history is on our side. Obviously, we look forward to a wonderful future for human beings on the planet Earth, and that's only going to happen with movements all around the world to raise awareness of climate change, to raise awareness of the circular economy and zero waste. And day by day, week by week, month by month, more evidence is coming that the message is getting through. So when it comes to dealing with policymakers and others, the two suggestions is, one, just encourage them to be more questioning, to be more skeptical, questioning of what we put forward, so that way they can get back to the sources and see the authority of what we're saying, and questioning of what the waste industry is putting forward and what their motivation is, exactly as Jane described. The second point is that in relation to the future, oh yes, for policymakers, is for them to appreciate that they need not to be trapped in the past, that it's the responsibility of policymakers to make plans and policies for the future, for future generations. If we remember the definition of sustainable development, it is about meeting our needs, not at the expense of future generations. And incineration does not do that. Incineration is not properly meeting our needs, and it certainly does come at the expense of future generations. So it is not sustainable. It has no place in a closed loop circular economy towards which we should be moving.
Great, thank you. So just a quick note, once again, thank you, Jane and Shlomo, for joining us. For folks who are on the webinar right now, just a reminder that we will be sharing the recording after we gather all the presentations. So you should get an email in about a day or two with the recording plus the materials. And then I wanted to let you all know that we are hosting another webinar next week called Why Resist Incineration in the Global South. In that webinar, we will identify what are the main drivers for waste incineration in the global north and analyze how this technology makes even less sense in the context of global south cities. We will also share how communities around the globe are fighting back incineration and promoting zero waste solutions. And you can sign up for that through our website, or there should be a link in the follow-up email from today as well. With that, I'm going to close it out. Thank you again to everyone who joined us and our panelists for all that great information. And we hope to see you all on our next webinar.